The last example, when I spent the first year or so after I began writing in 2005, 2006, writing about the complacent media, inevitably, invariably, the example that people would hold up, especially people in the media, to disprove the argument that we have a compliant and sycophantic press, is people would hold up the example of Tim Russert, and they would say, well, look at Tim Russert, he asks. I mean, people are petrified to go on Meet the Press. I mean, those questions are so, politicians go on there and they sweat and he uncovers the truth. I mean, he was sort of held up as the example that proved that adversarial journalism in America was alive and well, and it was a ritual that our most powerful political official would have to go before Tim Russert and be beaten down and exposed and uncovered. That was what always was said. That was how Tim Russert was held up and what he was claimed to symbolize. And during the trial of Louis Libby, it was one of those other very rare examples, like Scott McClellan's book, where the wall, where the curtain was pulled open on what the media did, because the media was very actively participating in the attempt to smear Valerie Plame Wilson and to ruin Joe Wilson's reputation. And so the media stars were the key witnesses at Louis Libby's trial, and Tim Russert was one of them. And one of the documents that came out during that trial was a memo from Kathy Martin, who was the top press advisor to Dick Cheney. And it was an analysis of the media options that Dick Cheney had. And at the top it said, when we want a message disseminated, we go on Meet the Press. And underneath that it said, Meet the Press is the ideal forum for the vice president to control the message. That's how Dick Cheney, in secret, saw Meet the Press. And while Tim Russert was testifying about the conversations that he had with various government officials, they asked him, well, what is it that you do in terms of your conversations with government officials? How do you decide when what a government official tells you can be disclosed, and how do you decide when it should be kept concealed? And what he said was, when I have a conversation with a government official, I consider that conversation presumptively confidential. And the only way that I feel as though I can disclose it is if they give me permission, is if they authorize the disclosure. And to me that was sort of the consummate piece of evidence about what our media is, because the idea that if you talk to government officials and only disseminate to the public the things that they instruct you or authorize you to say, that's describing, by definition, the role of a government spokesperson or a propagandist. I tell the public what the government authorizes me to tell them. And the fact that that came from the tough guy of American journalism, the person who Dick Cheney was secretly laughing was the best person to allow him to control the message, and which he did do on several occasions, I think really conveyed the myth of independence and adversarial journalism, and illustrates what they see their role as. A couple examples that I want to highlight that sort of illustrate that what happens if you try and exert independence in the media. In 2002 and 2003, the big MSNBC star, the rising star of MSNBC, was a correspondent. You may not even remember her. She's been out of the public eye for so long, named Ashley Banfield. She was first sort of notable for her physical appearance, but then she did a lot of actually quite brave journalism in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and she became a fairly recognizable media sensation for MSNBC at a time when they didn't really have any. And she was sort of the future of the network. That's how she was discussed. And in April of 2003, Ashley Banfield went to Kansas State University and gave a speech, which I really encourage and recommend as highly as I can that you go and read. Just go to Google and enter Ashley Banfield, Kansas State University. And the speech that she gave, she'd come back from covering Afghanistan and come back from covering Iraq, and she basically said that the American media was not engaged in real journalism in the way that it covered war. It was engaged in pure propaganda, that it was concealing the deaths, the civilian deaths, that the U.S. military was causing, that it was silencing the voices of the people who were questioning the war, that it was allowing the government to propagandize about what the enemy was saying without actually hearing from the enemy itself, that it was giving a tiny slice of the war that was not just arbitrary, the tiny slice that it was showing due to the vicissitudes of war, but was deliberate because the American media corporations understood that their commercial interests were served by keeping good relations with the government and being perceived as being patriotic networks. That was the speech that she gave while she was a rising star at MSNBC. And her star collapsed almost immediately after she gave that speech. She was almost immediately demoted to an obscure spot on MSNBC, and thereafter fired, and she's now the host of some court TV program that, if you can find, let me know, because I don't think anyone can. And that was an example where a reporter, a journalist, actually stood up and exercised some real independence, and the consequences were pretty swift and draconian, because independence is not something that is permitted or tolerated in establishment journalism, because, as Evan Thomas pointed out, as David Gregory said, that's not their role. The idea of independent media, as I said, I think can be best understood by trying to understand first what non-independent media is, which is predominant journalism, and then seeing how independent media is a reaction to it. And if you look at everything that I just highlighted about what the corporate media does and what the functions are that it serves, consciously now, explicitly, admittedly, I think that's the best way to understand independent media. I think independent journalists, by definition, attempt to do several things in order to avoid falling into those traps that corporate media, establishment media, now occupies almost exclusively. One thing is you try and you remain distant from and not a part of political power. And I think that's absolutely vital to being a real journalist, being an independent journalist. If anything, the independence of journalism means keeping a distance from, rather than blending into, becoming an appendage of, the entities, the political power structure, the financial elites that you intend to cover. I think it also means remaining completely free of the influences of corporations and government that will shape and influence what it is that you do. One of the distinguishing features of Izzy Stone was that he vigilantly safeguarded his independence, which he understood to mean that he would produce a newsletter, which wasn't cheap. It wasn't, the internet didn't exist. He couldn't just go online and find an audience that way. He had to actually produce a newsletter and print it and write it and typeset it, and yet he insisted upon producing a newsletter that was completely free of any advertisements, in order even to avoid the perception that he was beholden to any interest. And I think if you look at what mainstream establishment journalists are, it's not hard to understand why they do what they do. I mean, they work at the largest corporations. Those corporations depend upon amicable relationships with the government. The last thing those corporations want is for the reporting that they do to be disruptive to or provoke the hostility of the political power on whom they rely. They're owned by the wealthiest elites, which means that the agenda that those media organizations can disseminate cannot undermine the interest of the people who own them. That's just basic and obvious. And ultimately, what is rewarded in that culture is closeness to political power and to our elites. The closer you are to the politically powerful in that world, the more you're going to be rewarded. And so I think independent journalism is designed specifically to avoid those incentive schemes, to be able to write freely without any fear whatsoever. And in fact, considering the anger that you provoke among the politically powerful, not to be a cost or a risk to avoid, but a benefit that you actually want to pursue. And to me, that's really the nutshell of what independent journalism is. And I think more than anything, the key is to sort of grab a hold again of this language, and especially of the word journalism, and to start to realize that independent journalism is not a type of journalism, one of many different types of journalism that can be practiced. All journalism, by definition, is independent, and if it's not independent, then it's not journalism. And I think that's the spirit. Thanks again to the Park Center for Independent Media for this award, which I truly consider the highest honor. Thanks.